Welcome, everybody, to the Corning Museum of Glass Flame Shop. I'm Kristina Logan. I've been teaching here this week a group of glass bead makers, and today, which is exciting, is the demonstration that I usually do every morning for the students and every afternoon. I get to do live, which is great for everybody, not just the students, but everybody in the world gets to see. So today, I gave a drawing description of what I was going to do to the students, and I'm going to actually execute that bead now. I'm going to use a mandrel, which is a lot, excuse me, a lot, excuse me, a lot larger. No, I am okay. A lot larger than the mandrels that we've been using in the past. This one is, I don't know, about a ½ inch in diameter. And I'm going to wrap the glass around that. And I'm just going to get going right now. And if anybody has questions, you can write those in. Corning will be able to answer them, or I'll be able to answer them. Students, if you have questions, please ask as we go. We've talked a lot about this bead, so you kind of know what we're going to get into, but please ask. So I'm starting out by heating the mandrel to make sure that it is warm enough to receive the glass. I'm going to start with a red today. I'm going to heat that up. And just like I said this morning, what I want to do is make sure that my footprint to this bead is really narrow. So I'm going to put a wrap around here. I'm not going to worry about being very big yet. I'm going to start small. And then that wrap I can keep on adding to and fix it as I go. So if there's a little bit of a edge on the right or the left that's sneaking out from where the hole would be for the bead, I'm not going to worry about that, because as I add glass, that will settle in and tuck in underneath the bead. So I'm going to keep on going. So all those wraps that we did yesterday, right? They pay off, right? Because it's almost like you already have a large bead. So practicing those wraps on smaller mandrels will enable you to do this. I'm going to put another wrap, and then I'm going to show you a little thing that I like to do to even out the glass. Wrap all the way around. I'm going to give it a little smear. This is kind of a nice thing to do. I'm going to heat it up and then go back in with my rod and give it a light smear all the way around. And that helps even it out.
So you didn't warm up that rod?
Exactly. I did not warm up the rod. The rod is warm so it won't crack when I touch it, but I'm leaving it pretty stiff so that I'm using it kind of like a tool to go all the way around.
Kristina, kind of like
Yes.
you're moving the glass. If you put a dot at like 12, whatever 12 is for you at the end of that mandrel, so people can see it turning. It's really hard to see it turning.
It's hard to see that I'm turning it.
Yeah.
So even.
You're so even. It's just like, wow, how did the glass get around there?
All right. I'll do that, but right now I don't want to do that because it's going to distract me, but it's
Sorry.
interesting. So one of the comments, in case anybody can't hear it, who's listening live, was that it's really hard to see that I'm spinning the rod. And that is because, you know, over the years, the more that you do it, the more even this hand can become. So it's kind of like your lathe, you know, that mandrel hand. Now I'm going to start adding colors, so I'm just changing the color that I'm using. It'll look pretty much the same when it's hot, but I just switched from brick red color to an orange color. And all the glass that I'm using is soft glass. All the glass that I'm using today on this bead is, I think all of it is Fetre, an Italian soft glass. So I'm going to give a wrap of this orange. All the way around. And let that heat up. I'll probably add a little bit more before I marver. If your wraps, just like we worked on, in class, the more you can control those wraps, it is nice because then it cuts down on the amount of time that you take marvering and correcting, if you can lay that glass down nice and tidy in the first place. So stretching it all the way around. Oh, let's go one more. So one more with the orange. And it is, rather heavy to start with one of these mandrels. And then as you add glass, it gets heavier and heavier. So this is not, a bead that I would make, 5 times in a day. This is something that, I'd make smaller beads to let my hand have a rest, and then I would make a larger bead. If I did these beads all day long, then my thumb and my wrist would get fatigued. Okay, so now I'm going to pick it up and take a look at it. Make sure that it's the shape I want. I'm really happy with it right now. I don't have to do that much marvering. So the buildup, a little bit. Let's do is a little bit orange. I want to add a little bit more of yellow onto it.
Someone mentioned that they really like your bench setup, and especially the graphite grip below the torch.
Oh, nice. Thank you. So somebody said that they liked my, my setup and the graphite on the brick. So I'm teaching here in the studio, but when I am at home, that's exactly how I have my setup at home. I have a little, just a household red brick, and I have actually a red brick, and then my graphite is just a little bit higher than this at home. And what I like about it is I can put beads on it that I'm working on, so I can see them right in front of me. Or, sometimes I can actually have it completely clean, that graphite space, and I can roll my beads and use that as a marver, much like they use in hot shops. So right now I'm not using this today as a marver, so I'm just using it as sort of a staging area. But the other thing that I like about that is it's nice to have a dark surface behind my beads to illuminate them. So I can really see the profile of the bead carefully without distraction. Well, I have distraction of these beads, but when I have it right behind the graphite when I'm looking at it, then it gives me a really good sense of the profile of the bead. So does that make sense, the marbering that I'm doing?
Question about that, are you smoothing out the little bits of differences between the different layers when you're doing that?
So the question is, when I'm marvering, am I smoothing out the different colors and different layers that I put on? Right now, I'm not. It's been, the glass is melted in so much that it is already smooth, but I am marvering the total shape of the bead is what I'm after right now. And if I marver the total shape of the bead along the way, then in the end, it's easier. Like if I wait and I don't marver it until I've already put on, let's say, 9 layers of glass, then it'll be more difficult.
Right.
So I like to marver it slightly along the way to make it easier for me. So I'm going to put a little bit of red over the top of that yellow. Now I'm going to go right down the center of this one. So heating it up, a little bit bigger gather. It's nice when they work out nicely, isn't it? It's a good feeling. I think it's a good feeling too.
Watch it, huh?
Yeah. And so, you know, how do you do that, right? It is really, you know, not only about the application, but it was about the consistency of that gather and making sure that gather of glass was going to feed on properly. I had to make sure that, you know, the left side, the right side, the high side, the low side, all of that glass was all the same temperature so that it would feed on there beautifully.
And you gauge that by the color.
I gauge it by the color, and I take my time heating it up so I know that the heat is going to go all the way through that gather. Now I'm going to do another one that's even bigger, and you'll be able to see it with a transparent. So I'm happy with the shape of this bead.
Question from one of our viewers. They're wondering, when raking and poking, do you also use the graphite in front of the torch?
With raking and poking. So if the graphite in front of the torch, I mostly just use that. The graphite, the big square that's in front of me, mostly is that for marvering the bead. All the raking and poking is done in the torch, you know, in the flame, I mean. I have a graphite that's on the top of the torch. I rarely use that. It's often supplied in workshops, but at home I don't have one. So I've fallen out of practice of using the graphite that's right in front of me. So now this gather is larger, and I have a piece of glass that's doubled up in order to have that big, juicy gather. It's all one temperature. We'll put it on here.
Is that dark ivory? I mean, sorry, amber? Purple.
The glass, yep, that wrap that I just put on is a transparent purple.
Another question
Yeah.
is, do you always use so many layers of color in the base of your beads?
So the question is, do I use so many layers of color in the base of my beads? And I do. I mean, you know, sometimes I'll just do only ivory as the base. Sometimes when I do that, I'll use different types of ivory that give me different effects. But I really love layering color and the subtlety of, you know, color shifts where you might not see them right away, but they're there within the bead. And so I get that by, you know, layering and layering different kinds of color, either opaques or transparents. And then this, I'm just going to spend a little bit of time making sure that this bead is the right shape and that it's really centered on the mandrel. That last rod of glass that I used that was folded over like a tuning fork, I'll bring it here, this rod right here. So I keep that in the kiln so that it doesn't crack on me. But then when I want to add a little bit of glass to make this perfectly symmetrical, I'll just use a straight rod and not one that's doubled over.
Someone else asked if you have in your career, as you were learning to make beads, perhaps of this size or this style, did you have any tips for the viewers, or did you have any sort of aha moments that really you felt made the process go from difficult to easy?
So the question, I don't know, the question was whether or not when I first started making these beads, is there any tips or aha moments that I had that I could give to the viewers. This, I think my students will say, this is a difficult bead, right?
Yeah.
All right, I'm making it look easy, right? So I've been doing it for a long time, and I don't know, I think that the students would probably even say, what is it? It's practice. I don't want to just say that because it's so discouraging when somebody starts out. But if you love practice, if you love doing this, then it's not a chore. And all that little bits of progress you can make should be exciting, and you can be thankful for it. I think making larger beads for me came about from being comfortable making smaller beads. So my advice is that find your comfort level and then be brave. Be brave to risk being bad at something and trying it. I always am telling the students to turn down their flame, which I'm doing right now, and to work cold or to work stiff, because it gives you more detail, which I'm going to do right now. But in order to get that much glass around that big of a mandrel, you have to turn the flame up. So now I'm going to put dots around the outside. I'm going to stop and I'm going to heat up the bead to make sure that it doesn't crack in this process. I'm going to make my flame a little bit bigger and then I'm going to turn it back down and go continue with the dots. And what I'm looking at now is sort of the negative space between the dots for spacing. And I'm not going to worry about the size of them quite yet. It's really about the placement, and I can fix the size later. I can make them bigger or smaller. And as my students know, sometimes I'm happy with the dot placement. Sometimes I'm frustrated, and now I'm very, very happy with this dot placement. So that's good. Now we're just going to make them all about the same size. I'm going to add more glass because I want them to be a little bit bigger. And then we'll melt them in. And you can see that the flame is moving a little bit to the left. That happens. It depends on where you're working and what the situation is. Here in the studio, the flames have all been really straight on. In the filming today, there's a little bit of a breeze, so we have to deal with that. But, it's not that disruptive to the detail work. I'm going to go in with my knife and ever so slightly press these. And I'm not trying to press them into shape. I'm trying to kind of negotiate the space between the beads. I'm stretching the design a little bit. we go. So I'm going to stretch these so that they're a little bit more like ovals. It's kind of like moving butter with a butter knife. And I like using a knife that has a blade that is pretty thin so that it slightly sticks to the glass. So it has a little bit of a grab to it. It's interesting, you can have a tool that, wasn't meant for glass working. It was meant for, cutting into apples in the kitchen. But it's ended up becoming this invaluable tool to me. All right, we're going to really pull that dot over. So this is the fabulous fussy part. And if you can get the first row of dots just right, then all the other dots get to be, based off of them. I'm looking for the space in between the dots, that's right.
Question, how do you gauge when it's time for the insurance heat that you talked about?
How do I gauge when it's time for the insurance heat? So the insurance heat is referring to keeping the bead warm so it doesn't crack. And that's nerve-wracking, right? I find that when you start to really be able to control the dots and work really cold, that's when you kind of learn where the mistakes are and your bead can crack. I've heard some people talk about when the color changes, but that's deceptive because every type of glass has a different color when it's hot. Some of the blues will retain their color, but these reds and oranges change. If these colors go back to red or orange, then pretty much I'm in trouble. It's a feeling, not a feeling like in my fingertips or a feeling of the heat, but it's just time. If you make a bead and you do detail work and you crack it, then it's a huge learning curve. And it's really important because it'll teach you that's the edge of too cold. Okay, so now with these, the shape I want, I'm going to add another color.
Kristina, you mentioned earlier that one of the things you do with these big mandrels is heat them up as well on the sides.
I do. So when I'm heating them up, like right now,
Right.
I'm heating up the bead, but I have a large part of the flame on the mandrel. So on both sides, I'm keeping the mandrel hot. So that's really important, is to keep that mandrel hot, because this mandrel is hollow, and it can contract, and if it expands, when it's hot, and then it contracts when it's cold, the bead can break off pretty easily off the mandrel. And then you got to start again. All right, so I'm going to put another dot down. So this is where the fun patterning begins. Somebody asked me when I started making beads, and I studied fine art at the University of New Hampshire, and I didn't like color at the time. I was afraid of color. And I drew, and I loved figure drawing and sculpture and wood carving, and got out of school and worked in a cafe. And then somebody walked into the cafe, and he was, a fellow young artist, and he was working for a glass artist named Dan Daly. And I didn't know anything about glass. I really didn't know it was an art form. And I ended up working in Dan Daly's studio for 4 years. And it was a great experience. In that time, one night I saw somebody flame working, and I was so excited that I could actually do glass by myself in my studio. All I needed was a couple rods and a flame, you know, a torch and propane and oxygen. And I started, and that was in 1990. So it's been a lot of years since then of experimenting, you know, making. I'm going to move these dots over a little bit if they slide. Sometimes when the flame is really large and the bead, it has a big circumference, the dots can slide a little bit, especially if I'm going fast. Right now I'm trying to finish this bead in a timely manner. Sometimes when I'm working at home and I'm alone, I'll work a little slower. And the dots don't slide as much.
Are they moving with response to gravity?
They're moving in response to gravity and heat. Yeah. Mostly the heat because it's coming from that one direction. So I'm going to put dots on this. What else would I do, right? I'm going to put, let's see, we're going to use, hunting around, I'm going to use a transparent lavender. Oh, you know what? Before I do that, I think I want to, oh no, I'm going to do that now, and then I'll put the dots on the side. So I'll put the transparent lavender down.
This is going over the red you just put
It's
on?
going to go over the red. Remember, I like to change the colors ever so slightly by using a different color transparent, so not necessarily clear. And it gives you another palette. So in this case, it's the red, and then we'll put this lavender over the top of it. You could put blue, you could put, all those ambers really look good on red too. All right. Here we go. So I'm just trying to capture each red dot and not put that much glass on the ivory dot underneath it. Make sure the bead stays warm. Make sure the mandrel stays warm. Sometimes people ask me if I count my dots. I do and I don't. Like right now, I don't know how many there are all the way around. So many things I'm thinking about. But oftentimes when I'm home alone, I will count. And I think that sometimes the counting is just comfort counting. It doesn't really mean anything. Sometimes I don't even get all the way around before I start back on one again, you know. So. Okay, so now they have melted in a little bit, so I know exactly where they're going to stay. I'm going to, I'll use this one. I'm going to put some more dots on the sides now.
What color is that?
This color that I'm going to use is a opal yellow. Yeah, I like the opal yellow very much because it's an ivory that stays put and doesn't really travel and contaminate other colors. So doing these dots reminds me of growing up. My mother was an illustrator. a fashion illustrator in Boston. And so she would bring home garments and then draw them on to, you know, mannequins or draw them for advertisements. And so she always had a drawing table in the house. And I was allowed to watch her, of course, but I was never allowed to bump the table. So sometimes when I'm doing dots, and I always think, don't bump the table. And it just totally reminds me of my childhood. So this rod of opal yellow is thinner than my other rods. The opal yellow is hand pulled, so the rods are sometimes thick, sometimes thin. I just grabbed this thin rod. This is about as thin as I use for dots. Otherwise, I really like the thick. What are they? There are like 5 to 6 millimeter rods to putting on tiny dots. Okay, I got those on. Now they're on, I'm gonna just double check that they're the size that I want. So I can always add to some and take off others that are too big.
Kristina, do you ever do this bead and leave the dots raised?
Do I ever make this bead and leave the dots raised? You know what, I don't. When I first started doing a lot of dot work in beginning, I left everything raised. I love that look. I have some here on the table. But nowadays I'm just melting everything in. But it's funny because when I see this bead halfway through or partially way through, I always look back and think, oh, I kind of like that. I should leave it, but I don't. Yeah. But I encourage you guys to do that. You know, get halfway through, stop, put it in the kiln, start another one.
Someone asked if you do anything special to your ivory glass to give the effects that they see in the final bead.
Do I do anything special to my ivory glass to give it the effects in the final bead? That's a great question. We talked about that a little bit the other day with the students. The ivory that I get always comes in, like every batch is different. Sometimes it feels like the rods are smooth. Sometimes it feels like the rods are rough. You know, sometimes the light ivory will act differently than buying what is called dark ivory. Sometimes when you put a dot down with the ivory, it'll stay really crispy and clean. Sometimes it'll look like curdled milk. You know, it'll have that kind of wonderful granular quality. So I don't necessarily treat my ivory differently. I just keep it in different piles in the studio and use the ivory that I want to create that effect with.
So can you tell pretty much before you put it in the flame which way it's going to go?
Oh, that's a good question. Can I tell ahead of time by just touching the rod of ivory? They're like, what will this do? Right, exactly. Sometimes I'll look at the end, the very butt end of the ivory, and that can tell me whether or not it is like really consistent, like it all looks like one smooth color, or if it looks like a bunch of different colors on the very butt end. Sometimes the smoother ivory, smoother to touch, will leave a crispier line than the granulated ivory. So I can kind of tell. But then experimenting is the way to go. If you want that really granulated look, like that curdled milk look, I have found that the longer you work in the torch, the more that erupts to the surface. Like you just beat it up, beat it up, beat it up, and you get more and more crackle effect, if that's what you're after, which I like a lot. Where are my dots? There they are. So, you know, these larger beads often take just more time to heat up. So you have to not only spend time decorating them, but spend a little time warming them up so they don't crack. And I think that that's really the story of hot glass in general. You know, there's the making and the doing, and then there's the waiting, and then there's the, you know, heating up and the sort of passive doing, which ends up being really important. And it's also what I love. You know, sometimes doing a demonstration gives me that feeling like, oh, I have to hurry up because it's boring. But I have to remember that if you really want to show how something is done, you know, the truth of it is often about the time it takes to make it. And, you know, I can show you how to do this, but then it's sitting down and taking the time to work on it. And so these dots on the side are a little bit small. I'm going to be making them a little bit bigger. And I love doing this. I love making beads.
Christina, when did you move from making dots that you left raised to everything you're making now is it just
Oh, that's a great question. The question was, you know, when did I go from making these dots and having them all raised to making them smooth? There was a time when I had, you know, all those raised dot beads, and I also had simultaneously smooth beads. And I'll talk about that in my slide talk tonight, but there was sort of a transition when the dotted beads and the smooth beads kind of came together. The patterns came together. And I think that was early on, but it's true, I kind of abandoned those raised surfaces at some point for this.
you could really stop right now?
I could stop.
You would
Yep,
have a very different effect.
exactly.
Did you switch colors? Is that white now?
I did switch colors. I'm using a white now.
So it's opal yellow on the left side and white on the right side?
No, it is the opal yellow are all these very small dots on the right and the left, and then I'll flip the bead over so that you can see, or I'll do the same thing over here so you can see. I'm just doing another layer that is white and bigger.
And that's going to have color over it later.
That's going to have color over it, right. And then those little opal dots I'm going to leave.
Yeah. I'm looking at your bead down here because that's what where you're going, right?
Exactly, yep. So I'm going to leave those. I'm going to flip over to the other side. So take a look, students, at the position that I'm in, the hand position, and how I'm sort of tipping the bead down and working on that top surface, and where my head is in relationship to the mandrel and the glass rod. That makes sense?
Yeah.
So it actually, in time, that side becomes easier and easier to work. And I like working on that side now more than the right side, strangely. And I don't know if it's just because that top surface.
One of our viewers asked if they aspire to be able to make a bead of this size, you know, one of the enlarged mandrels. Do you recommend that they buy a series of smaller ones and work their way up, or just go for the large one and apply what they've learned to it?
That's a great question. So it was whether or not, like, if somebody wants to start working on one of these large mandrels, do you just jump in and grab one? Or do you, buy smaller ones and slowly work up in size? That's what I did. I worked up in size. I think that a little bit of your personality is revealed sometimes when you work. So if your personality is someone who loves to jump in to unknown territory, go for it. If you're a more cautious person, then get the smaller mandrels until you feel comfortable to jump ahead. It's definitely a challenge. It's a challenge to, you can get the glass to go around there. Yeah. But having it even is the trickiest part, okay? So I'm just gonna forge forward. I wanna put maybe I'll, for this bead, I'm concerned about time. So I'm going to just go ahead and put, this is a pink that I'm using, a transparent pink that I'm going to use over that white. I want that white to be a little bit bigger, so I am going to put a couple dots of this opaque pink on it first. So I'm going to go just across here. White was my first dot. I want this to be a little bit larger, and I want it to be a little pinkier. So I'm going to add the pink. It's so much easier and faster when you already have a dot down. And I'm just going in the center of that. So it's just a subtle change and much easier.
Well, it's like you said yesterday, getting that center first row of dots around a bead. If you get that right, then everything else just
It is so true. It's the hardest row is that middle row, getting that down. And after that, all your spacing is so much easier. So it's really that concentration. Like when I said how happy I was about the spacing, I knew the bead was going to, have the kind of, make me happy and have the kind of spacing that I want.
have two good sides.
Yeah, two good sides, right. So the reference to two good sides is, if I make a bead that one side I don't like as much, I can always grind that off and use the side that I love for jewelry. But if I have two sides that I love, then it stays as a bead. All right, now I'm looking for that pink. Here it is. So a little shout out to a company called Double Helix, and they make glass color rods, soft glass rods. And this rod that I'm using, I love. It's a pink called Rhea.
What does double helix mean?
It's just the name of their company. Double Helix is the name of their company.
Okay, it doesn't have anything to do with the glass or the way the glass is formed.
It doesn't have anything, no, I mean, they might have a meaning to, why they named their
DNA.
company. Exactly. It sounds like there's some profound meaning there, so we'll have to ask them. But it is just the name of their company.
Maybe they wanted to be the DNA of the process.
Kristina, do you always lay the same color dots on each side of the bead?
So the question is, do I lay the same color dots on either side of the bead? I am doing that today. No, oftentimes I'll change colors on either side of the bead. And, I love to do that because it gives me two chances for, a different palette and two chances for like which one I would like to make jewelry out of, or just an interesting bead that has color on either side. So definitely change it up. So again, the dots. Covering it. Around. And now I'm going to make sure that my bead stays hot. Yeah, it's pretty like that, right? At this stage, I'm like, oh, I really like that. If I were to keep a bead with raised dots like this, I would have made the raised dots much slower. This bead would take longer to bake because I would pay attention to each dot and exactly how I put it down and how I lift it up, and I'd want them all really, really uniform. This, I mean, it's precise, but in some ways it's a little bit messy because I know that I'm going to melt it in. So there's a little bit of freedom in that.
I think messy is a relative term.
Messy.
This is a very relevant term.
Or like we did yesterday. I mean, if we really messed it up, we can just feather it, right? And just take all that decoration and just...
That's one of the things I love about glass is how if you start in one direction, it doesn't work out the way you want, you can always change it to something else.
Yes. Yeah, you can always do something to it, right? As you're working on it. And then
With that really ugly disc yesterday.
just keep on working it.
Got it.
Yeah.
So are you melting in now? Or?
I am melting in, and I'm going to add a little bit more glass. What I'm doing is I'm melting it in, but I'm trying to judge how much those dots are spreading, because I really like them to spread a lot and sort of bump into each other. And the tiny little ivory dots that I have in there, done with that opal yellow, they will turn into little triangles if they're really packed in there tight and they get pushed by the bigger dots. So I'm going to, I want them to push in a little bit more. Let's see. So I'm going to add a little bit more glass on the top dots. The long beads that I make, the ones that I call them totem beads, but they're very long bicones. Getting back to that question about the raised dots versus the melted in dots, there was a time when I made them only with raised dots, and I distinctly remember finishing a bead that took me forever, you know, I don't know, 2 hours or something, and it cracked. So instead of just throwing that bead away, I melted in all the dots.
To heal the crack?
And just to see what the heck was going to happen,
Right.
and it ended up being a beautiful pattern, and so it was born out of a mistake. That's kind of nice.
Yeah.
Okay, one more wrap around here. I'm just adding glass to increase the size of those side dots. And I'm going quickly. I've got my mind on time right now. I'll just say it again. When I'm at home, I tend to work a little bit more slowly. Or maybe that's an effect of just thinking that when I'm at home, I'm not talking as much. So it feels like I'm going slowly. I don't know. All right, now we're going to melt these in. And I'm keeping the flame not only on the bead, but also a little bit on the mandrel. The flame is kind of in between the bead and the mandrel. I'm going to get out my graphite paddle. And I'm not going to worry so much about the top edge of the bead as the sides. I'm going to marver the sides first, on the right and the left.
And you're marbling why?
Say that again?
Why are you marbling?
I'm going to marver, well, to smooth the bead.
Okay.
Yeah.
Because it wouldn't smooth enough just melting in?
It needs a little help.
Okay.
Yeah.
And you're working on one side so that you can keep the other side stiff, is that?
That's correct. I'm working on one side that's really, really hot, and the other side stays stiff.
Someone asked if you ever work in porcelain.
The question is, have I ever worked in borosilicate glass? I think I've probably pulled points, maybe 10 points in my life. And that's about it. And so in general, I'd say no, I haven't. I would love to. I'm super inspired by the creative work that's being done in borosilicate right now. And that could be something fun. Or, is there a way to, I don't know, do a collaboration with somebody? But it's, I'm all soft glass. And I love the way it works. It's like, your material.
Right.
It's just
Kind of cool, the scallop edge, you got,
just a little bit, there's a little edge.
Yeah.
All right, so we're getting there. So I've got the right and the left.
It's gorgeous.
Not bad, right? And now I'm going to heat up the top edge. And then I'm going to pick it up and face it towards me. And I'm going to press ever so slightly on some of these dots. Because I'm going to push them down. Well, first I'll do the sides again.
You just barely touch it.
Oh, barely touching. This is just a really light touch, the marvering. I'm just going to really light touch on pressing them. Yeah, most of the marvering I do, it's just threatening the bead. It's not really doing anything to the bead. It's just telling the bead, I'm going to touch you. So here we go. I'm going to look at it again, straight on, nose forward, and just press some of those down.
Before you press, you let the surface just slightly cool to
I don't know if I let the surface slightly cool right before I press. I definitely don't press them when it's juicy hot. So I take it out and I rotate it, and I don't put the tool to something that's really super juicy. So I think I must wait a little bit for that. Yeah. So a little bit more marvering on the top. Okay, now it's smoothing out beautifully. I actually want to put, I got my eye on the time. I think I have time to do this. I'm going to add a little bit of this striking orange on my pink, because what could be better than orange and pink?
Just a tiny dot.
A teeny dot, because it spreads quite a bit. Or you could do a big one. This is an aesthetic decision.
The way you're pulling the glass off the rod, it keeps it just a little point every time, so you can do a tiny dot.
That's right. So I'm attaching this transparent cold outside of the flame, and then I put it in the flame and I pull it off. And every time I pull it off, it leaves a little point.
Right.
And then I'm going to do the other side. So I don't do any extra movement besides just lifting up that dot into the flame. Like I don't twist it or pull it or move it at all. It's just,
I do notice that you always get it slightly pointy before you start on the.
I do get it, yep. So what I like to do is, a big thing that I use is the graphite right in front of me. One of the most important things is a marver to roll the glass in front of me. And I do that to put the glass away when I'm laying it down on my table. And I also use it to make the rod really nice in order to prepare for making dots. Oh, I'm very happy right now about this bead. And now I'm going to get ready to put all the little tiny decorative dots down.
Wait, there's more.
Wait, there's more. What should I do next? How about some dots? So there's that pattern. And, I get questions about, like, well, how do you get those little triangles to, appear? And it's really time of doing it again and again and realizing how much the quantity of glass on each dot and how close the dots are to each other. So I'm going to use this opaque blue, turquoise, for the dots. I turn my flame down a little bit. I'm going to make sure that my bead's hot so it doesn't crack. I'm going to turn down the flame a little bit so I have a little bit more precision.
Now it does going.
On top of the orange and pink.
These are going on top of the orange. Yep. I'm going to heat up the bead again. Keep it warm. And then I'll go back in and finish those dots on the right before going over to the left.
Because that bead's so big, it has so much volume in it, it probably doesn't lose heat quite as quickly. as
This
the
bead
smaller
is
bead,
large,
right?
yep, because how large it is and the volume, it does hold heat quite nicely.
But the consequences of letting it get too cold are also bigger.
That's right. Okay, super exciting. Now we'll go to the other side. It's getting that first dot down that's always like, oh, where is it?
I think so too.
Okay, I'm going to warm it up, and then I'll go back and finish it. When it's this big, I can't go all the way around. It would risk cracking the bead, even though it's so tempting.
What do you mean all the way around?
Like to keep on going until I get all my dots all the way around.
Oh,
Sometimes you
gotcha.
have to stop and reheat the bead.
Oh, gotcha.
Yeah.
The orange
Yeah,
that
that's
you
always
use-
where I crack beads, is the dotting,
Mm.
because you just get so into it.
The orange you used was just a tiny dot that's underneath the.
Yep, the orange I used is a tiny dot, and it's a striking color, so it will you'll be able to see it before it goes into the kiln, which is nice. And all it does is just give a little platform to that dot.
Yeah.
So I'm going to put dots on the top. And as the students know, I put a dot down, and then I pull the dot towards me, the bead towards me. So I'm going to put the dot down and rotate the bead towards me.
Oh, right.
Yeah. Okay. All right, 2 more rows. Woo! Did you see that? I made that one a little bigger. Okay, and one more row on the other side. I think that definitely, because by now, in this bead, if I were making it at home, I would know how many, does anybody know how many dots there are around the outside edge? I don't know. Usually at home I do, and I'm like, oh, 13, that's a nice number. And then, I'll be like, oh, 4, that's a nice number. Well, whatever it is. But I don't know what this is because I've been chatting, so I haven't had the chance to do my comfort counting. All right, we'll do it around the other side. So maybe somebody count for me.
I'm gonna say an even number.
Oh, I am very happy with what we got going on here. All right. It's 15.
15?
Yeah,
Okay.
it's 15. So again, I'd think, oh, 15 is a nice number.
Oh, that's so funny, Kristina.
What?
Someone online guessed 15.
Somebody guessed 15? Yay! Okay, then you win something, right?
That's pretty
There
good.
was a question about where else you teach or what your sort of teaching schedule is like.
My teaching schedule. Well, I will be back here again this summer. And then if you're interested in any classes, I haven't yet taught anything online, though I am considering it. So if anybody has feedback or, comments, questions about that. But the best place to go is my website. If as far as teaching here at Corning Museum of Glass, look at the studio. I often teach here, but then you can also look at my website. All right, so now it's the final, cleaning it up, threatening it to become perfectly smooth and round, but not that much touching, okay? Since I already made the base of it really smooth and round and regular, this glass should suck right into that base and not need that much movement. And it's really, sometimes I'm just feeling at the tips of my fingers whether or not this feels round, whether or not it is completely smooth. I think that's done also in the,
Like kind of counteracting.
on the hot shop. You're feeling whether or not that is smooth and round because you can't always see it with your eyes.
Are you also striking that one red?
I'm not worrying about that red striking, that orange striking. It really just happens with the time
Right.
that I am at the torch, and then the rest of it will happen in the kiln.
Right.
So a couple more wraps here, and we'll call that a bead. And then you can see, hopefully the cameraman can see, but here on the surface of the graphite is very much like the bead that I just made. So you can see what it will look like when it's cold and it's out of the kiln, which we'll take out of the kiln tomorrow and then clean it up. And let's just do one more fun thing, is see how big it is, right? So I like to sometimes measure it. So I'll measure and see. It's about like that. And then I like to judge it against one of these. So it's a little bigger than this guy. And you can imagine how much bigger that one is. But
And that was on a smaller mantle.
yeah, that was on so that's a lot of glass. But there's the diameter of the one that I just did, which is a tiny bit bigger than this. But I think that I'll just sit back and then you can let me know, camera, whether or not I can put it in the kiln.
Whenever you're ready.
Whenever I'm ready. Okay, so I'm going to open up the kiln. I'll turn off my torch so I don't burn myself. And open it up and we'll pop it right in there. Thank you, everyone. Yay. Awesome.
It was a fabulous demo.
Now you go do it.
Now you can lunch first?
Yeah.